Now let's turn our attention to the downstream petroleum sector in Nigeria, focusing on the regulatory environment, consumer protection, and the impact of deregulation. Well, joining us to discuss is one of Mr. Jide Pratt, the COO, Iona, and a country manager at Trade Grid. Joining me to explore the complexities and the implications for the Nigerian economy and consumers. Great to have you.
Thanks, Ladi.
It's, I guess it's Happy New Year at this point.
It is.
Last time I spoke to you on this show.
It was last year.
Last year.
Absolutely.
Welcome.
Good to see you.
And a lot has happened,
Yep.
Before then. But before we get into it, I remember many years ago, everyone would say, and experts and, economists will say, if Nigeria starts to refine its own oil, everything would be great. Fast forward to now, we're seeing a lot, happening at this time. We're refining. We have a big private company with a refinery. We have most of our public refineries coming back online at this point, but there's also talk, about distortions, here and there. And PMS, we're paying prices we've not known before, we've never seen. So, for you, where are we, at this point? Why isn't it El Dorado with refining?
Thanks, Ladi. It's always a pleasure talking to you. So let's start with the fact that there was a lot of misconception that once we start refining in Nigeria, it will be the silver bullet. That was an incorrect notion, and clearly we see that now. So let's backtrack. 4 or 5 years down the line, we had no refining capacity. It was zero. So I think we should start with the first to win. The Dangote refinery came on stream. And that has closed the gaps that we had for local refining. A lot of conversations around Warri and Port Harcourt coming on. While they may be on, they might need to ramp. While they are old refineries, efficiencies might not be there, but it's neither here nor there. So we're refining. The second thing is that once you start to refine, we're looking at a conversation that now dovetails around energy security. So you'd say affordability, accessibility, availability, and adaptability. Those are the quadruple A's of energy security. In that mix, we'll pull in things like regulation. And why does it need to do that? Because you see, one thing that must happen in an economy that deregulates is that competition has to be allowed to thrive. The more people in that space that compete means that they begin to drive efficiencies. Ultimately, we're talking about the customer here now. Now, if they drive efficiencies, then they're able to give some sort of relief to the customer. So I said that to say this. What it means is that while competition is being encouraged and must be driven, there must be regulations so that it's an all-comers affair, but it's an all-comers affair for people who are capable of playing in that space. The next thing will now be that, where are we now? We've seen prices undulate. We've seen prices go up. We've seen prices go down. So back to regulation. Where and how should those prices move? There is no hard and fast answer yet.
So the regulator does come out and say, no, prices should be at this rate to favor the consumers.
So the regulator cannot say that. So now we're going into fair pricing.
Right.
In fair pricing, it means two things must happen. The consumer must not be overly burdened with paying a cost that is prohibitive. But at the same time, the people who have put the investment, so you've got depot owners, you've got refineries, they're investing some capital. They must also get a return on the capital. So it means that the regulator's job is to guide the market. And you guide the market by doing things like, okay, what kind of pricing methodologies are you using? Is there a price discovery model? Personally, I believe there should be a price discovery model. Why does that do that? It tells you, if you put A, B, C, D, and E together, this is the ballpark that you should get to. The regulator might struggle with that, saying that, should I be the one to guide the market on prices? Look at the PPP era. We were in a non-deregulated economy then, and then there were prices. There was a guiding template for everybody to know. If you went to places like Ghana has been deregulated for a while. But on the NPA website, that's the National Petroleum Authority, you can see the prices that guides what you call the bulk distribution companies. So that template is a guide. If you went to Kenya, if you went to Chile, I mean, all these places have that price discovery.
And we also have a guide here.
What
a
guide?
Pricing guide.
Well, when you say we have a guide, I'm struggling because if I went to the regulator's site, I don't see that guide. That ideally, that should be in the space of the regulator. And what does that do, Ladi? It opens up transparency so that there's a method to the prices we're driving to the pumps. Because if you asked an average guy, what do you want most? The average guy could tell you, I just want prices that are cheap. But while prices could be cheap, am I able to return my investment? I've built a depot. I've done an integration in terms of depot, I own trucks, I run retail stations. So
right,
see,
and looking at the business angle of it,
correct.
We know you're in business to make profit.
Correct.
But you know, we've had challenges in Nigeria. That big word, profiteering. Everyone wants to make more profit than they should.
Correct.
So that is a risk we have in this industry.
It is a risk, which is why we were talking about the regulators. So on that side, there are two regulators. For the industry, you have NMDPRA, which is why I'm going back to a price discovery. But also the FCCPC has a job to do in terms of, okay, what is fair in terms of your return on investment? Are you overtly charging? Do you want cost-reflective tariffs, back to the NMDPRA, or do you want value-based tariffs? Is there a mix of dynamic pricing where you can say that, okay, where you're at home, for instance, if you went to power, if people are in the office, then it means that if they're using more power, then maybe we should charge a higher kilowatt per hour on that end. When you're back at home, do we reduce it? We must get to a stage, Ladi, where there's transparency, but there's also a guide. Does the regulator want to put a price bar and say that you can't go beyond this, or a price floor? But you see, in doing all these things, two people must be taken care of. The person who runs the investment and also the person who is buying at the pump. So that guiding principle has to be done by a price template, in my opinion.
And, you know, from what we've seen so far, it seems the bulk of the pressure is put on the consumer, you know, at this point. So what should the regulator be doing at this time to, you know, change that narrative? Because at the end of the day, the average consumer is hit from all sides.
Yeah.
Everything is going up, you know, at this point, even though we got the January inflation that shows inflation is rising at a slower pace compared to with the new methodology, you know, at this point. But what should the regulator be doing?
It still goes back to the ballpark of transparency. The regulator has to guide this industry. Why does the regulator do that? If the regulator doesn't do that, then it means players in that space can wake up in the morning and I want 100% profit. But if there's no basis to 100%, who stops them from doing that? Regulator. We're going back to FCCPC. So they must be engaging conversations. NMDPR has to be having conversations that, look, if you're bringing in X amount in terms of import, what is the basis of your pricing? Is it CIF? Is it FOB? What are you looking at in terms of shipping? There must be some transparency so that if the regulator has that data, then the regulator can say that, but you're charging an excess amount here based on what you've landed. But if they don't have that data to compute, Ladi, then we'll keep on having these conversations, but it will be up in the air. There must be a guiding template. It must be published. It must be transparent. The regulator has to ask the players, what is the basis of price A or price B? Have an understanding, and that way they can protect both the person who is investing and the end user. That is the way it has to happen.
Right, and I'm talking about, you know, protecting the end user. You know, on social media, we've had that talk about whose fuel is better, you know, when it comes to the major refiners, you know, in the country. And, you know, there's also that talk about, you know, sulfur content, you know, which one's burning slower, burning faster. But in all of this, how do we make sure the consumer is getting quality?
That's a brilliant question, Ladi. And it goes back again to regulation. You see, we can't have this conversation any which way without regulation.
Right.
So look at Petrol. The petroleum regulator is the NMDPRA for downstream. So they say this is a specification sheet. And I'll take an example of PMS. You would see, in terms of specific gravity at 15 degrees Celsius, you would see a range of 0.72 to 0.78. That is a guide that the regulator has put in. You would see things like research octane number, minimum 91. It's a guide, because what they're saying is that the quality must not go beyond this standard, whether you import it or whether it's locally refined. So those are guiding principles that the regulator puts out. If you look at products, what makes a product burn faster? These factors also play. If you also looked at that video, there was something that we noticed in the video. The colors were similar. It is important that if you looked at a specification sheet for petrol, you would see clear and bright. So petrol by effluxion is more often than not like water, light. But everybody that refines or in that process adds what you call a dye. That's why on the same spec sheet, you might see things like ox blood in terms of distribution. So under color, they'll put clear and bright. You now see color for distribution, ox blood red. And that is to differentiate. You're not carrying water.
So ox blood is not a bad thing.
It's not a bad thing. So, so it's a dye issue. They're putting dye into that so that for safety reasons, for differentiation, just to be able, you're not carrying water, and don't get it misguided. Of course, there's a smell, there's a look and feel, but I mean, the more you see, let me backtrack. Years back, I remember when jet fuel, which is aviation fuel, and kerosene are very, very similar in terms of properties and characteristics. So in the industry, there seems to be some issues around people selling one for the other. So the regulator then decided that, you know what, put green dye in jet fuel. So automatically, if you're lifting the green, quote-unquote, colored aviation fuel, you know it's jet fuel. You can't put it in your kerosene stove. Only the regulator can do all this guiding.
I'm talking about, guiding. I remember some time, many years ago, I think I was in secondary school. There was a kind of fuel that was imported into the country. Had a terrible scent, a very strong scent, but we've never had that issue, since that time. So I guess it's safe to say we've had quality petrol, so far in the country.
It's safe to say we have had quality petrol. Now, another thing might be at what quality, because you did mention something about sulfur. So ideally, the less sulfur that there is, ideally, the more expensive it is. That's how it should be. And the more sulfur there is, then of course, the cheaper it should be. So it means that if somebody is supposed to get to 20, let me say 20 parts per million, and is at 50, then it means there should be a price differential. Means that it should be cheaper going towards 50 and more expensive going to. These are also things that need to be guided by the regulator. What you talked about then was basically ethanol. So the quantity of ethanol probably was much more than it should have been for that process or those cargoes that came.
Back then?
Yeah, back then.
Or was it bad for the cars then?
I'd say yes, because your combustion is based on, and you always hear Nigerian-grade gasoline, Nigerian-grade gasoline. So clearly, the cars that we buy, the consumptions of those cars in terms of combustion is made to a certain specification. So if there's too much ethanol, it could have issues in terms of clogging, but I'm not a mechanical engineer. So, I mean, those are the things that happen. Right. But I think we've gone past that to a large extent.
All right, so, it's 2025. What do we need to see more to, bring sanity into this industry and to, so maybe Nigeria, the average Nigerian can at least pay an affordable price
I would
for
say,
PMS?
I would say two things that are critical, and we've talked about the regulator in terms of transparency. But we also need more competition. We need to be able to bring in as many players that can play in this industry, because you see, competition will drive efficiency. If it drives efficiency, then what it means is that my cost to the public reduces, because I'm able to drive efficiencies. But data is still the most important part, Ladi. We need to be able to go to a website of the regulator and say, okay, these are what the prices look like. We need to be able to apply dynamism. So if crude oil drops, at what stage did it drop? If the gasoline index has also dropped based on crude oil drop, then we should see that reduction at the pumps. We shouldn't wait for, so let's get dynamic. And at the same time, if we cut it now and say that crude oil prices have gone up, then maybe there's an increase. But that dynamism should not wait, where you hear people driving to the station and saying, but you've changed prices now. Why did this price go down and then you're still selling at the old price? And then I'll tell you, but if it went up, you would have changed immediately. And then people will tell you it's stock. So things like weighted average cost of capital need to come into the mix. But two things are key, and I'll end by saying these two things being very, very key. Competition has to increase. It must continue. Local refineries, importing, that is the only way we will drive efficiencies. It cannot be this person do this person, no. And then fair pricing. The regulator needs to check that. But what is most important is that there must be transparency. I think these are the things we need to do going into 2025.
Right.
To be able to do.
Still early days, and we do hope all of that, plays out in this industry. So Ladi can drive to the filling station and not always have his heart broken.
Ladi, go to CNG. Go to CNG. Go to CNG.
Yeah, CNG conversation. That's not been coming up this year, but we'll revisit that.
No worries.
Thank you so much, Jide Pratt, COO Iona, and country manager at Trade Grid.
Thank you, Ladi.
Thank you so much for coming on today.
Always a pleasure.
I'll take a quick break now. When we come back, we'll see what's playing out in the global economies. That's in a moment. Just stay with us.